The Princess's Plight. Cariel, Princess of Elboria, was frustrated. For nearly 3 hours she'd had to sit calmly on her throne, looking regal, whilst one disgruntled citizen after another came to air their petty disputes before her father. Only once had she been able to have a far too short break. She hated try-days, and this one was worse than many. At least sometimes the conversations she witnessed were of some interest. Not today, though. The petitioners deliberated on and on about the most menial things, as her rump grew number and number, and her patience wore thinner and thinner. It wasn't fair. There was no need for her to even be there, apart from display. At least Ulrius, her brother, he was heir to the throne and needed to learn how to handle such things himself. The king would often consult his opinion when making a decision. Even her mother would be asked to give input from time to time, especially when the dispute involved a woman. But Cariel never offered any contribution to the discussion. She never wished to. And yet she still had to be there. At least no one objected that she had a completely blank expression on her face as her mind wandered off into a daydream. That was probably the only positive thing about being blind. People had low expectations. When at last the ordeal was over, she shuffled down the hallway to her room, suppressing a tear of exasperation that was trying to escape from the corner of her sightless eye. As she rounded a corner, she blundered straight into somebody. She'd been so focused that she hadn't heard his approaching footsteps. The man apologized profusely, but she shrugged it off and continued on her way. She recognized his voice. He was one of those special messengers that kept coming to her father, Cade, if she recalled his name correctly. Of the two messengers, she disliked Rotak the least. There was always something about Cade that made her feel uneasy. Not that she had a great deal of interaction with either of them. Come to think of it, their visits had been much more frequent of late. It seemed scarcely 4 days went by without a visit from one or other of them. When at last she reached her room, she collapsed on the bed and began sobbing into her pillow. In a moment, her handmaiden, Lamia, was at her side. "Oh, milady," she cried, "I was just about to come and escort you here. You shouldn't have come back here by yourself." Maiden was really a bit of a stretch. Lamia was almost as old as Cariel's mother, and was widowed. "Dearie me, what can I do for you, milady?" "Out!" Cariel ordered, pointing in the general direction of the door. "Please," she added, "I just need some time to myself." "Yes, my dear," said Lamia, as she hastily retreated. Cariel felt a little sorry for her. She had, after all, been trying to help. The trouble with Lamia was that Cariel just couldn't connect with her on a personal level. On the one hand, she acted as though she was just a servant and a commoner attending on royalty, which she was. And on the other hand, she acted as a protective, motherly persona caring for a child with a disability, which, again, she was. What she never acted as was an equal, a friend, a fellow person who would empathize with her feelings. While she was very good at what she did do, and Cariel was very thankful to have her, she just wasn't the kind of person she needed right now. After a time, when she was feeling calmer, Cariel rose and crossed the room to her window. She opened it a crack, which allowed a gentle breeze to come seeping in, inciting the strings of the Aeolian harp that was there fixed. The instrument produced a soothing, ethereal hum of harmonic frequencies. She then lay back on her bed, clutching a bouquet of fragrant flowers to her chest, and began to ruminate on all the anxieties that had been troubling her of late. It must have been nearly an hour later, when there was a soft knock on her door. "Come in," she said. She knew who it was. Nobody else had a knock quite like that. "I thought you'd be busy with father," she said to her brother as he entered the room. "I was," Ulrius confessed, "but I thought I'd better come and see you. Lamia said you'd been upset." Cariel frowned up towards the canopy of her bed. "You're supposed to be learning to be king. Should you really be wasting your time like this?" "If a man can't care for his own family," said Ulrius, as though reciting a well-known proverb, "then how can he care for his country?" Cariel sighed. "Besides," the prince continued, "father's having one of his secret meetings with Elma." Cariel couldn't help but smile a little at the mention of the seer's name. Elma had always been so kind to her. Even though she'd been quite young when he'd first come to the palace as King Newland's advisor, he never talked down to her. She thought of him almost as an uncle-like figure. Indeed, he probably meant more to her than either of her actual uncles. "I saw that Kate was about again," she mentioned, not realizing the irony of her word choice. "We've been hearing a lot from those two lately." Cariel could hear the frown in his tone of voice. "I do wish Father would tell me what they're about. Or at least where they even come from. How am I supposed to take over the throne one day if he can't even share all his business with me?" "I'm sure he has his reasons." "Of course he does. I just wish I knew what those reasons were." "He's sure to tell you eventually." "He keeps saying he will. Just not yet. Which he's been saying for about 5 years. He paused and then muttered, "Sometimes I feel like he just doesn't trust me." "Oh, I'm sure he does," he perked up and said with conviction, "I just wish I knew." Crossing the room, he lit a small incense burner, which began filling the air with a pleasant aroma. "Enough of my trivial gripes," he said. "Tell me, what's been bothering you?" Cariel slowly sat herself up on the bed. "I don't know," she began. "I guess I feel lonely. Sometimes it seems like nobody really cares about me. Oh, I know you do," she added, before he could respond. "And Father and Mother, of course. But you're always so busy all the time, and everyone else treats me like I'm an item. I'm just the princess to them, not a person. I don't have any real friends." "Well, you'll have to share some of the blame there, I'm afraid. Why, no less than 4 suitors came for you last week, but you refused to see any of them." The moment the words were out of his mouth, he realized his mistake. He saw the moment when her face fell, and it pierced him inside. "I'm sorry," he said, "but you get what I... 4 complete strangers sucking up to Father and asking for my hand in marriage is hardly comforting," she almost shouted. "They weren't strangers," Ulrius foolishly objected. "All of them were known to the..." "I'd never met them!" This time she really did shout. There was a long, awkward silence. "I think," the prince proposed tentatively, "that's what they wanted to do." Cariel snorted. "Well, come on. How could you complain about never meeting people if you won't let them?" "Do you really think they care a fig about me? I'm just a means to get Father's attention, to gain political importance. And even better for them, I'm blind, so I won't stir up too much trouble at home. Not one of them wanted to know me as a friend." Ulrius was tactful. "I expect you're right. But perhaps one day someone will come along who's different. How will you tell if you won't even meet him?" Her scowl softened a little. "By all means, send him away if he turns out to be another snob. But at least let the attendant finish telling you his name first," he said with a slight chuckle. "I'll think about it," she muttered. "My dear sister, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who would admire you for who you are, if you gave them a chance. And I know it doesn't mean much to you, but you truly are the second most beautiful girl in all of Elboria." She raised her eyebrows. "Second?" A mischievous smile crept over her face. "Why, dear brother, is there something you've been hiding from me? Tell me, who in all the land is more beautiful than I?" she said with mock grandeur. "Well," Ulrius began and then stopped. Cariel couldn't see the blush on his face, but she could hear it in his tone of voice. "Well," he tried again, "there is a certain young lady by the name of Taleth, who happens to work at the..." "A tavern wench!" Cariel burst out laughing. "My brother, Crown Prince of Elboria, has fallen in love with a tavern wench!" "Don't call her a wench," he said indignantly, "and don't shout so loud. I haven't told anyone else yet." Stifling her paroxysm of laughter, she inquired in a more respectful tone, "And tell me, what does the handsome prince see in this eating-house serving girl?" "Apart from her stunning good looks, you mean?" "Never noticed them," she said flatly. Ulrius wasn't quite sure whether to laugh or not. "Well, she's kind and caring and considerate of other people," he began. "That's one point said in 3 different ways. Well done. What else?" "She's a people person. At work, she has to chat with all sorts of people and listen to them. As such, she's familiar with seeing issues from many different perspectives. Seems to me that would be a valuable asset in the future queen." "Well reasoned. But tell me, are you looking for valuable assets in a future queen, or the love of your life? Can't a woman be both?" In an ideal world, yes. Assuming you yourself had all the most valuable assets of the future king. Unfortunately, we're stuck with what we've got, she said in a teasing tone. Of course, in an ideal world, everyone would be able to see, too. Reality is you'll probably have to make some sacrifices in one camp or the other. Well, I'm sure Taylor has her flaws, Ulrius began. List them! Cariel demanded. Ulrius was a bit put out. Well, there's... He groped for words. She's... Sometimes I've noticed... Well, it's hard to think of them off the top of my head. You couldn't see her flaws if they all lined up in front of you and did a floor dance, she laughed. You're in love. That makes you as blind as I am when it comes to the subject of your affection. Well, I know that eating houses are not normally the place where one expects the future royalty to originate, but even Mother was a merchant's daughter. Not just any merchant, a very high-class one and head of the Merchants' Guild, she pointed out. If it comes to that, the Peacock's Perch is hardly some disreputable old tavern, but a very refined dining establishment. Very well, you win this time. But next time we eat there, I'm going to be keeping a very close eye on this Taelith. Figuratively, of course. Just please don't tell anyone. I'm not ready for that yet. My dear brother, what on earth did you think little sisters were for, if not to keep secrets? Next morning, Quat Day morning, Cariel awoke feeling refreshed. This day would be much better. No sitting around for hours on end just looking important. No supercilious aristocrats plying for her hand in courtship. Oh, there were still a few royal appearances and important meetings she had to attend, but nothing so tedious and boring as the tri-day hearings. All the same, by the time noon had rolled by, she was feeling quite stuffy, having been cooped up in the palace all day. She was reclining in a comfortable chair, while Lamia read to her from a book of poetry, when Ulrius again came by to visit, and offered to escort her out for a ride. "Oh, I'd be delighted to," she exclaimed. "But don't you have important duties to attend to?" "Maintaining my proficiency at horse riding is one of my important duties," he explained. "Besides, if a man can't care for his own family—" "Yes, yes," she shushed him up. "I'll meet you at the stables in 20 minutes. After concluding their reading, Lamia helped her into her riding clothes and guided her to the palace stables. Cariel loved the rich, musty smell of the horses and the sounds of their heavy breathing. The jingling of bridles greeted her ears as she entered, as Ulrius had just finished saddling her horse, Breeze. She carefully felt her way over to the mare's head and gently stroked her muzzle. The animal responded with a cheerful whinny and nuzzled Cariel's chest in a friendly way. She giggled with delight. Lamia, her voice full of concern, urged her to be careful. Cariel merely waved her fluster away with an idle gesture. Ulrius gave her his hand and guided her up into the saddle. He then went around and double-checked all the straps, ensuring they were secure and of the appropriate length. They had an escort of 4 fully armed guards until they were safely out of the city. Fortunately, there was a post and wall gate not far from the palace, and that part of town was never especially busy. And then they were out, into the wide open air, into the wonderful liberation of the northern plains. Cariel laughed out loud with glee as Breeze cantered freely about the fields, the wind whipping in her face and tossing her hair wildly behind her. After several minutes of free wanderings, she allowed Breeze a rest to munch upon the fresh, earthy grass, and Ulrius drew his horse up alongside her. "Well, dear sister, where would you like to go today?" he inquired. Cariel considered the feel of the air and the warmth of the sun on her bare forearms. "Shall we go by Nodrum's Ridge? And then, if the weather is still fair, I wish to bathe at the pool." Ulrius obliged by urging his horse onwards, and gave a sharp whistle to Breeze, who fell in behind him as she was trained to do. Nodrum's Ridge was a line of low hills that overshadowed the Circlay River. It was less than 20 minutes away, riding at an easy pace. Soon the pair reached the saddle that was just beyond the highest point. There they dismounted and sat on the grass, looking out over the river and the valley beyond. "Tell me, brother, what do you see?" Cariel asked. Ulrius surveyed the landscape before him, taking in the scenery. "Far in the distance I see the great hills of Berimbor. The sun paints their left sides with gleaming gold, while their rights are shrouded in a mystical, shadowy blue. A silvery streak running down them marks the falls of Salendara. At their feet marches a line of tall, majestic pines, marking the course of the Tiriaf River. Before them are the farmlands, blanketing the ground in a patchwork of yellows, browns, and greens, gently draped over the softly undulating landscape. The farmers' buildings are dotted over the countryside. On the hilltop by the road, the fan of a windmill gently turns. The sky above is a mottled mixture of creamy blues and milky whites. In the far northwest, the clouds are dark and gathered together, and it looks like rain is brewing. But nearer, and to our left, there is a great clear opening from which the sun sends down its lancing rays. All this is beautifully framed in by the curve of the knotted ash which arches over us. Cariel took a deep breath, listening to the breeze whispering in the branches overhead, and drinking in the beautiful sounds of his words. She could only imagine what they actually meant, as she had been blind from birth, and had no idea what anything looked like. Still, she always loved the poetic way he described the picturesque landscapes he gazed upon. Even though they had overlooked that same view many times, with the changes of weather and time of day, he always found a different way to describe it, and she never tired of listening to his depictions. After a long while of contemplation, she frowned slightly. "You said there was rain brewing. Will it come near us?" Ulrius shook his head, and then, remembering that she couldn't see this gesture, explained, "That is far away, and the wind is in the east. If it does fall, it will not be near us. The sky directly overhead appears to be clearing more than anything." She let out a long sigh. "Well, then, can you take me to the pool?" "With pleasure, dear sister." Offering her his hand, he helped her to her feet, and then back into Breeze's saddle. The pool they spoke of was not far from Nodrum's Ridge. It was a small, secluded waterhole in a narrow, rocky hollow in the hills. A merry cascade trickled down into it from the low cliffs above, and a narrow creek led out of it, flowing down towards the river. There was only one practical way in or out of the pool, for any other route would involve shoving through the thick undergrowth that crowned the stony walls, and a rough climb on the rocks themselves. It could be done, and wouldn't be too difficult, but it wouldn't be very pleasant, and certainly wouldn't be quiet. Ulrius surveyed the water, checking for branches and other objects that might become a hazard, as well as for any unfriendly eyes that might be in the area. When all was clear, he retreated from the pool and sat by the rough path that led down to the hollow, just around the corner from eyeshot of the water. "The water is all yours," he said with a smile in his voice, "save for a pair of ducks and a few tadpoles." Feeling her way down to the boulder that sat by the water's edge, she removed first her boots, then her blouse and riding breeches, laying them on the rock where she could find them again. Stripping off her undergarments, she tiptoed warily down to the bank, now completely naked, except for the bracelet. She dipped her toes in the water. Icy cold it felt at first, but she soon built up her courage and stepped in up to her knees. Carefully wading forwards, she felt the edge where the bottom suddenly deepened. She took the plunge and immersed herself entirely. The refreshing tingle that surged through her was marvellous, even if the sudden cold stole her breath for a moment. At the deepest place, she could stand with her head and shoulders above the water. She swished her arms back and forth, feeling the currents swirl through her fingertips. Then she lay on her back and floated, splashing about and enjoying the spray that she made. She giggled with glee at the revitalizing feeling. The only thing that truly bothered her at that moment was the bracelet. It sat high up on her left arm, above her elbow, where it was often hidden by her sleeves. It was the one item of clothing she could never remove, except on some rare occasions when she was at home in her room and felt that her personal comfort was more important than a bit of added security. It was woven of metal in an intricate braided shape, and held at its centre a stone, a pink sapphire she'd been told it was, which housed the enchantment. It was that enchantment that was her greatest protection when away from the palace, and allowed her to have so much freedom despite her condition. Whenever someone unfamiliar or hostile towards her were near, the bracelet would cause a strange tingling sensation to course down her arm, alerting her of the potential danger. She was very grateful to Elmer, who had obtained it for her when she was still a child. Nevertheless, as she fingered the chafing metal, she longed to take it off and let the water flow unobstructed over her upper arm. The closest she could come, however, was to slide it a bit higher up, close to her shoulder, and bathe the part of her skin where it normally sat. After a time, she moved over to the part of the pool where the cascading water came tinkling merrily down from the cleft in the rocks above. Sitting down at the base of the waterfall, she leaned back against the sun-bathed rock and let the waters spill all over her. It was a wonderful, enlivening sensation as the water gushed and gurgled over her shoulders and around her back, pooling up in the hollow of her lap. When at last she was beginning to think about getting out of the water, Cariel was suddenly struck by a thought, which seemed to just appear out of the blue and burned away in her mind, enraging her curiosity. The cascade flowed down a series of steep steps, but directly beside it, those same rocky ledges led up to the hilltop. In all the times she had visited the pool, she had never thought to climb up those rocks. It simply hadn't been of interest to her. Now, it suddenly bugged her that she'd never tried it. She couldn't describe what had given her the desire to explore, but she felt sure that if she didn't do it now, it would continue bothering her for the rest of her life. Groping about against the rock face, she found it pocked with plenty of cracks and crevices that would make useful handholds and footholds. Climbing up would actually be quite easy for a sighted person. Even for herself, it wasn't too big of a challenge to feel for a good grip and then pull herself up. When one foothold was too insecure, there was always a better one right by it. In this manner, it only took her a minute or two to reach the top. Then she encountered the thick foliage that lined the edge, and she realized that escaping from the hollow wouldn't be quite as easy as she'd anticipated. Still, she managed to thrust her way through the bushes, driven on by the mysterious burning curiosity which had suddenly struck her. Holding her hands out in front of her, she carefully felt her way forwards. Fortunately, none of the bushes had thorns, but their rough branches still scratched at her bare thighs. Finally, she emerged from the thicket into a field of knee-high dry grass, which swished around her legs as she passed through. It itched and tickled her legs, and prickled underfoot, but it was much better than the clawing bushes. She pressed on through the grass for nigh 100 yards. As she did, something began to bother her. She couldn't say when it had started, but gradually some uneasy thought began to well up inside her. She slowed her pace, trying to think. Why had she climbed out of the hollow? Why was she now striding across a stretch of open grassland with no clothes on? What had inspired her to do such a thing? She still felt that same burning curiosity which drove her on, but now she was questioning the reasons behind it, and she couldn't think of any. If she truly desired to find out what lay ahead, wouldn't it have been better to first dress, and then ask Ulrius to accompany her? A worried frown crossed her face, but still she continued forward. And then she heard a noise, a huff of breath, as from an animal, perhaps a cow or horse, but it sounded even deeper and larger. The shock it caused snapped her out of the bizarre daydream that had hovered over her, and she realized the other thing that had been bothering her. Her arm was buzzing with that strange tingling sensation caused by her bracelet. She was aware that it had been going on for some way now, but now it was so strong it felt as though her fingers were almost going numb. Her hand even seemed to be vibrating unsteadily. Fear crashed over her as she was suddenly aware that she was standing many yards away from help and completely naked, right by a large unknown animal and a potentially hostile stranger. A scream started to escape her mouth, but it was cut short as some kind of cloak or blanket was thrown about her shoulders, wrapped around her and pressed across her chest by a muscular arm, and a large hand was clamped over her mouth. Terror gripped her just as firmly as the stranger did.